sense taken for granted. Husserl simply claims that within ethical life, values must be critically reconsidered in the light of formal axiological laws. In the lectures on ethics of 1914, which entail the main lines of Husserlian formal axiology and ethics, Husserl argues that values are either values by virtue of other values, or they are original values or values as such. In the first case, values are derived from original objective. Just a moment, because I had a technical problem. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. In the first case, values are derived from original objective values or values as such. In the second case, values are themselves those objective values. But do feelings and emotions through which values are grasped allow us to maintain the objectivity of the original value? And are feelings and emotions the appropriate experience to grasp something objective? The aim of my presentation is to address this question, exploring Husserl's account of values in relation to the tension between objectivity and relativity that emerges from the dynamics of Gemüt. First, it is essential to briefly clarify the main framework under which Husserl speaks about values. I will do it by points. First, within the natural experience, the subject experiences things according to their specific value character, axiological character, and practical characterization. Second, within the transcendental reduction, values are considered as objects of specific intentional acts, namely acts of valuation. So this consideration makes it possible to ask how the subject experiences values, on which basis the axiological experience is grounded, where it originates from, and so on. These intentional acts are acts of feelings and evaluation and emotion. And such evaluative acts, as it will emerge, have a rather complex articulation. In my presentation, I will consider the evaluative act in its more passive level as pre-intentional, pre-objective, and intentional objective. And this level is represented by feeling. So this means that I will not consider the active dynamic of value constitution, so the theme of emotional approval and so on, which completes feeling. Before starting, I should specify what concept of objectivity I'm referring to. By objectivity of values, I mean the possibility that the same value can be grasped by different subjects or by all subjects. Inverting the terms of the proposition, if a value is objective, it is then the same for all subjects who grasp it. It can be intersubjectively recognized. So second part, I will summarize some key results of the static analysis in order to deepen the value experience. As known, methodologically, static analysis are the basis for generative ones. I will thus recap by points, also simplifying what emerges considering the Husserlian model of foundation and the issue of the objectifying and non-objectifying acts. So acts of feelings are complex acts of consciousness. They are non-objectifying acts, which means that the intentional objects are not things. That means that those acts are not presenting acts with presentational content. As complex acts of consciousness, acts of feelings are founded on objectifying acts. That means on acts through which an object is represented. This foundation is an ontological, namely a mereological relation of different components. And this dependence of non-objectifying acts on objectifying acts leads to a twofold consideration. On the one hand, such a foundation makes clear a distinction between two different orders of properties, natural and axiological, and their origins. On the other hand, this foundation implies that the value of an object is experienced on the basis of the objective, Husserl says Gegenständliche, in this case, objective properties of the same object. In fact, in his reflections of the 20s and 30s, Husserl claims that an object has its own peculiarity on the basis to which it gains the objective value, which means a value that is intersubjectively recognizable. So the distinction between the different types of acts preserves the difference between different regions of realities and ensures not to fall into the improper shift from being to ought to be, denounced by Jung. The Husserlian theory of acts highlights at the same time a connection between axiological and logical or natural properties in order to not fall into any form of extrinsicism between the axiological and the doxic natural dimensions that would lead to a value relativism. The non-objectifying acts are in fact strictly connected and in a way not separable from objectifying acts. The connection between doxic natural and axiological properties should therefore be investigated further. To this end, it is useful to ask how the passage from one level to another occurs. And this question, which implies the understanding of the dynamic of a development, needs to be asked from a genetic point of view. So, coming to the third part, based on genetic analysis entailed in some texts from the second volume of Studien zur Struktur des Bewusstseins, I will try to examine the life dynamics of feelings, considering how the passage from the natural to axiological level is conceived, and whether such understanding assures the objectivity of values and what the subjective participation in drastic values means. First, I will try to reconstruct what emerges from some texts from the second volume of Studien. So basically, the scheme Husserl sketches to define value properties reveals what the static analysis already describes, which means that on the one hand, the differentiation and the stratification between the non-axiological and axiological properties is meant in the sense of a conjunction and of distinction. In fact, Husserl claims that values are given in the evaluation, which is based on the empirical sensible appearance of the object that is given in the perception. A new kind of apperception is at work in the constitution of values, namely the value apperception, that is the emotional apperception, Gemütsapperzeption, founded on and blended with the empirical apperception, empirische Perzeption. When an object is grasped, is apprehended through a certain emotion or feeling, this object has an emotional characterization that derives from the way in which it appears to the subject. The perceived object appears with its features, which are already emotionally characterized. That happens by virtue of a new sort of motivation, which corresponds to the emotional apperception, that is, namely, emotional motivation. It is thus necessary to try to understand how this new kind of motivation, as Husserl repeats several times, is described, and if possible, how it works. Husserl describes this motivation as axiological motivation, as a Motivation der Art des Unwillens, that could be translated as a motivation of the type of being based on or for the sake of. I'm open to any possible suggestions about the translation. That means that liking or disliking an object is based on the way an object or a situation appears to us. In this way, when we like an object, it receives the corresponding feeling coloration, Gefühlsfärbung. In the perception of an object, there is a system of signs for its being likable due to empirical association that is interviewed with intentions of liking. On the one hand, Husserl claims that there is a variety of manifestations that awaken the feeling of liking. On the other hand, the object is likable for its own sake. Therefore, the likable character that belongs to an object in a specific situation arises from the way the object appears to me, from its being, so to say, system of different way of being likable, and therefore of indication and motivational connection. In connection with this level of the emotional experience of feeling, Husserl speaks about the fulfillment of the valuing act värtschätzung. Feelings as like and dislike are in fact intentional acts. The level of value Wertschicht is pre-given, also says, thus constitutes itself starting from feeling reactions in relation to a thing or a situation. Husserl claims that a thing raises feelings reactions on the basis of a stimulation, Erregung, directed towards the subject and motivated by values. As Drummond states, feelings represent the affective response to the thing or situation, namely to non-axiological properties. Through them, the subject evaluates the situation in which she finds herself. In order to better understand the emotional motivation and the connection between the non-axiological and axiological properties, it is necessary to delve deeper into genetic analysis. So the way in which an object appears awakens, due to emotional motivation, the intentional feeling of liking and disliking connected to evaluation. Such feelings are nevertheless based on a more basic level of the constitution, namely on a more passive level of feelings. The perception of a thing is connected with primary sensations that involve also feeling reaction. These are bodily feelings or sensuous feelings, sinnliche Gefühle, feelings of pleasantness and of unpleasantness, of well-being and not well-being, pleasure and displeasure. They are defined as a kind of feeling determined on a sensation basis. Indeed, Husserl claims that sensuous feelings are related to or even belong to sensuous elements, to sensations. Such feelings represent then, as Husserl notes, the receptivity of feelings. In order to reflect on what has been mentioned, I will briefly summarize and order the main passages of the genetic analysis on which I've directed my attention. In a text from the 1911, Husserl claims that the subjective experience of values presents the following sequence: think motivation, Denkmotivation, value motivation at the level of sensuous feelings, and at the level of liking motivation. So, three different stages within the passive level of the value constitution can be distinguished. First of all, a thing or a situation presents itself and is perceived according to its non-axiological properties. Second, a reaction to the thing or situation appears in the subject on the basis of empirical sensations awakened by a thing or situation. This is the level of sensuous, non-intentional feelings. Third, a second level reaction to the stimulations of a thing or situation based on its non-axiological properties is the level of intentional feelings, which intend the value properties of the thing or situation. So it is thus important to underline the specificity of the just mentioned stages of the value constitution with respect to the theme of the objectivity and relativity of values. The importance of sensuous feelings within the value constitution becomes clear, considering that even if they are not directly connected with values, nevertheless, they represent an important connection between empirical and axiological perception, thus a relevant element for the constitution of the value character. In other words, sensuous feelings are subjective feelings deeply connected to objectual perception. They are the subjective passive response to the first stimulation of a thing or a situation towards the subject. They do not intend any intentional object, any value, but at the meantime, they are essential for the value constitution. Drummond notes that sensuous feelings must be considered both in relation to the body of the subject and in relation to the thing or situation. He argues that because of that, those feelings represent the connection between the subject and the object. They are states of the organism, and they turn our attention to the thing or situation that erases them. In this sense, they appear to be a fundamental junction within the constitution of values, since they connect the non-axiological level with the first intentional axiological level, namely that of the intentional feelings. In other words, they connect the level that seems to ensure the objectivity of values with a more subjective level of intentional feelings of liking and disliking. Regarding intentional feelings, it has to be noticed that on the one hand, they are connected and in a way motivated by sensuous feelings. On the other hand, the former is not simply determined by the latter. There is namely relevant participation of the subject at the stage of intentional feelings. Personal beliefs, cultural influences, traditions, and previous experiences have a role in determining how the subject reacts to some non-axiological properties and to the connected bodily feelings. The fact that the property reminds me of something joyful is in a way connected also to the cultural level of the subjective experience. That means that being in a certain context, belonging, so to say, to a surrounding world, influences which values we grasp and the way those values appear. In other words, the cultural substratum has a role within the value constitution. Already at the passive level, namely at the level of emotional association and motivation, the cultural dimension is operative. The dynamic connected to intentional feelings makes clear that an emotional experience is first personal, which means that it is related to a particular person with her peculiarities. In connection with the main issue of the paper, it is then necessary to ask the following question. Does the being subject related to the value experience affect the objectivity of the value, or is it still possible to speak about objective values? So in the third part, I will try to sketch a possible answer and to sketch some conclusions about the question of objectivity and relativity of value. So following our considerations, it results that the constitution of value from a genetic perspective has an objective and a subjective direction. How are these directions compatible? On the one hand, value refers to moments, so to say, of the object, which are characterized as grounds for value. On the other hand, the feeling through which valuing is fulfilled is an act of the subject and is in several ways influenced by subjective experience. Indeed, as Husserl writes, the feeling is in me, by myself, by me. At the same time, it is still true that feelings in general depend on the being of the object and on its non-axiological properties. In the text 4 of the second volume of Studien, Husserl considers the question as follows. Let us examine a feeling of joy in connection with a physical object, a thing. From the noetic point of view, Husserl distinguishes, on the one hand, joy as an aspect, as a feeling raised by the object. So there's all the objective sides that I already tried to stress. On the other hand, there's a delight in the object, taking something as valuable. And in the second case, the direction is towards the object towards which I am turned, zugewendet. But we can ask, is not the valuing, liking, wertende, gefallen also raised by the consciousness of the object, namely by the way the object appears? This means, are these two directions together or separate within the subjective experience? Before proceeding in answering this question, it has to be noticed that in this context, Husserl uses the word Zuwendung to express the idea of the subjective being turned towards a valuable object. And this topic cannot, of course, be addressed in detail here, but it's nevertheless useful to consider some passages where Husserl uses this concept, because this concept is already involved in gefallen and missfallen, and it expresses in a very peculiar way, the specific direction of feeling. So from this perspective, I will refer to the Zuwendung. A possible answer can be found in the same text where Husserl claims that turning towards and being stimulated by, so Zuwendung and Erregtsein are always together. All the stimulations co-participate in the Zuwendung. Husserl also thematizes the present question as a question of the unity of feeling and of the character of feeling. And he says that this unity of feeling is constituted by the unity of objective Erregung and subjective Zuwendung. So in this sense, this issue indicates a relevant direction to deal with the issue of objectivity of values, considering these two directions of the value experience being together. So coming to some preliminary conclusions, the question of the Zuwendung suggests us a possible path to deal with the main question of the objectivity and relativity of values. The correlation of objective Erregung and subjective Zuwendung and the way they are together means, on the one hand, that objectivity belongs to values. On the other hand, the possibility that certain values are captured also depends on subjective Zuwendung. According to Husserl's analysis, no value could fully be captured without subjective Zuwendung. A mere thing, Husserl affirms in the 20s, has no value. It can have value only in relation to what it means for subjects. End of quote. However, this does not imply that subjective affective attention alone is sufficient. To conclude, I suggest considering the question as follows. The subjective involvement within the value constitution is the only possible answer to a value. According to our inclinations, personal history, and attitude, the subject refers to something as valuable. Considering the subjective side of value constitution through feeling, it becomes clear that without any subjective personal involvement, it wouldn't be possible to have any access to value. Based on that, I argue that subjective personal involvement in the value experience is a fundamental condition to grasp value. On the other hand, given that the object at a non-axiological level is, in a way, the same for every subject, and given the stable connection of the subjective experience with the non-axiological level at each stage of value constitution, the being valuable can be then considered in a way the same for every subject, just experienced through different perspectives. So these considerations provide, hopefully, the basis to speak about values as objective references within ethical experience, as they are addressed also in the essays on renewal. Of course, I'm aware that my analysis of the more passive and of the first, so to say, active level of the value constitution are not enough to fully take into account and understand the issue of objectivity of values. For example, the topic of emotional approval, of the critical reflection on value should also be considered. However, I hope that I could give a useful contribution to the main topic and to its many and particular aspects. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for this very nice presentation, which is very difficult. The topic is very complicated, and your systematization is very useful. So, are there any comments or questions for Julia? I wrote there in the chat. I don't know if you saw that you can write your questions here. And Luisa said that your presentation is brilliant.
Thank you.
And no questions here. Okay.
Comments, critics.
I have to admit some. Sorry.
Also, feedback, critics, comments are welcome.
Luisa here has a question for you. She says, may you add anything about the critical moment about values? So about what you said in the last part.
Yes, so yesterday Alexis spoke about this topic, I think, quite deeply. And so it's not the main issue on which I focused my attention for this presentation. But I reflected about this topic in relation to the topic of, in relation to the problem, to the question of the objectivity and relativity of values, especially as it is addressed in the essays on renewal. And I would say that, so in the essays on renewal, I have the impression that Husserl comes to the claim, so to say, that we can speak about objective values, or it can, so it can in a way be interpreted what Husserl says, that we can come to objective values only after a critical reconsideration of them. But so my problem with this claim is then that we should submit our values that we already have, in a way, so values that we already grasp, to a critical reconsideration. And so we come to a level that is not more axiological, or not just axiological, but also ethical, because this critical reconsideration happens in a way on the basis of a radical decision, so on the basis of the decision of the subject to have an ethical life. And if it is so, then it would mean that we can come to the objectivity of values, or we can speak about objectivity of values only after, only at an ethical level. And so, in my opinion, this could be problematic in the sense that could we speak about an axiological objectivity or not? So, or do we have to refer to an ethical dimension? I don't know if my question is clear, but I reflect about this topic in this sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And we have here another question for you from Irina. Oh, can you come closer, please? Yeah. So,
Hi, Julia. Thank you for your talk.
I don't know if you can see her.
It's fine. If she can hear me, that's good enough. So, like, given this question that you had and the fact that you're talking about non-objectifying acts and objectifying acts, so I understand that axiological acts are non-objectifying, right?
Yes, axiological acts are non-objectifying
acts. I was wondering whether you'd consider like the moment of, like the critical moment of reflecting upon what we value as being the moment where like the objectifying act, you know, is introduced. You know, there's the moment where the non-objectifying act receives the possibility for objectification, because these acts, they don't, you know, they work together. You know, they're not like, so just to say, this is one way in which you could incorporate like the critical position, or like, you know, in your like research, or
yeah,
in your position.
Okay, thank you very much for the suggestion. So I think that when also speaks about objectifying, non-objectifying acts, he refers to a previous level than to the level, and not to the level of a critical reconsideration. This is, of course, well, yes, I think this is an objectifying act, this critical reconsideration, but at another level. So surely we can consider this question also in terms of the distinction between objectifying, non-objectifying acts, but the distinction between objectifying, non-objectifying acts within static analysis is referred to the stratification of the axiological experience, where objectifying acts are founding acts for axiological acts. That means acts that present the intentional context, the thing.
If I may just
Yeah.
make a comment to you, I think it makes sense to consider different senses of like different senses of object consciousness, because you can speak about objectifying acts as perceptual or acts or presentifications, the founding acts that give you the what of the experience. But I think Irina was referring to the constitution of the objectivity of values as objectifying. And that would be objectifying in a different sense. That does not only refer to the perceptual basis or presentational basis, but that also incorporates already the axiological strata. So
Okay.
I think that's something similar to what Alexei was saying yesterday when he mentioned approval, because approval of values is a process of recognition or acknowledgement of the objective character of the value. And that's maybe I don't know if that's objectifying, but that's somehow constitutive of the objectivity in a different sense. But it's not objectifying as in the other sense, in the underlying, I think.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
But
Thank
it's
you.
very complicated because I don't know how you can consider that as critical process. It's some kind of emotional critical reflection, but.
Do you think that it is an emotional critical reflection, or because I think that is the point, you know?
That's the point. I think he's not here. Alexei, are you here?
Yeah.
Because I think
to ask him.
Yeah, because he said that this process of approval, and there are some reasons to say that, because Husserl himself says something like that. It's emotional position taking on first order evaluation.
Yes, but an emotional position taking.
Yeah, but it's emotion. So it's like a second order emotion or something like that. Yeah. You can call that emotional reflection, but or emotional critique.
We reflect upon our emotion. That's the whole point of this. Distance yourself from what affects you. You take this, you look at it. You examine it.
I
No,
couldn't hear.
Irina is saying that it's an emotional position taking requires that you take some distance from what affects you. No?
Okay.
It's not that so we have emotional attachments, right? Where we value things emotionally, right? Our affective values. But they're not there just like we can take them, we can take distance from them, right? We can take a position towards them by examining them reflectively. So it's like a reflection, examination of the emotional. Yeah. So,
yeah. Yes, I think that this is a step that I have to make to continue my to deepen the topic of objectivity. Of sure. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much, and thank you for the question, Irina. So we will. And now we will present Lorenzo Pompeo. Are you there?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So wait a second that I will. Oh my God, I think it will be Lorenzo. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you, Lorenzo. is from the University of Trieste and the University of Udine, and he will present a paper entitled New Humanity and New Creation, Pauline traces in the Husserlian essays on the Erneuerung. So thank you, Lorenzo. We hear you.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias. Quiero agradecer en español también si mi presentación será en inglés. Can I share the screen? No.
You want to share your screen?
Yes, if possible.
Okay. We are working on it.
Okay.
They will do it in another computer.
Okay.
So just 1 minute, please.
No. Sorry.
Tendrías que preguntarle a los demás. Preguntarle a los demás. Pero si no, cambiar.
¿El volumen? Sí, o sea, lo puedo subir y bajar aquí. Bueno. Sí que ya lo...
Okay, it seems that you are already co-host. Can you share your screen?
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Great, thank you. Gracias.
Okay. So, my presentation will mainly consider what Husserl wrote in 5 Essays on Renewal on religion and Christianity in particular. And in particular, it will be my intention to identify possible traces of a Husserlian reading of the epistles of St. Paul in connection with what Paul himself wrote in his epistles on the renewal of man. Firstly, I think it will be useful to introduce 2 textual passages in which Husserl refers directly to Paul. Both are found in Appendix 4 by Lagen 4, entitled Religiöse Wirkung von Legenden, dichterischen Gebilden. I report in English, in German, but I have a translation here to read. At the beginning of this appendix, Husserl, when describing the effect caused by the image of Jesus Christ as a supra-empirical figure leading those who read the gospel stories to the absolute and perfect good, refers to Paul as a historically, individually determined figure compared to that of Christ, presented in forms that Husserl finds most legendary. So, first I quote, when I read the Gospels, I'm not moved by miracles, die Wunder, but the figure of Christ, as indefinitely legendary as it remains, in contrast to the individually determined figure of St. Paul, as it manifests itself in its ethical basic direction through various sayings and parables, awakens in me a kingdom of perfect goodness, ein Reich vollkommener Güte. Later, we find perhaps the most interesting passage in which the philosopher reveals his admiration for the apostle. Of Christ, I have an archetypical idea of a good God-man, not Mensch. Of Paul, the idea of a noble, God-filled preacher and a struggling and brooding man, Gott erfüllten Predigers, beautiful expression, and a seeker striving for clarity and pure life for himself and other Christian believers have, needs concrete daily requirements to find the appropriate standards, etc. Unquote. So, it is therefore possible to affirm that Paul, therefore, played plays an important role with regard to Husserl's general idea of Christianity, for sure. With respect to the 5 essays on renewal, however, there is who have hypothesized a specific influence on the Husserlian interpretation of the idea of renewal. Christian Lotz, professor at the University of Michigan, in his essay of 2013, stated that Paul would outline his idea on the category of renewal right from the reading of the Apostle Paul. So at this point, I think it is therefore necessary to understand, to examine this interpretation and to understand if it would be possible to find an affinity between Husserl's reflection and the Pauline annals. Here comes into play what I'm referring to in the title, the new creation. And it is a doctrine in which Paul makes extensive use of a terminology related to the idea of new, renewal, newness, novelty, already extremely important in the Old Testament. It will be useful to summarize the fundamental points here, emphasizing in particular the Pauline terminology related to this newness, before putting the results in communication with the Husserlian reflection. First of all, so a synthesis of the fundamental points of this Pauline doctrine. The person who is in Jesus Christ is made a new creator or new creation, connectesis. The old things have passed away. It is the time of an advent of the new. In this new condition brought by Christ, salvation is separated from mere belonging to a certain ethnos or from the daily adherence to the law. Circumcision or uncircumcision no longer availed. What matters is to be a new creature through a regeneration, a renewal, palingenesia, kenosis, that the Spirit operates in man. However, this event must always and continuously be renewed so that it is preserved. The new man is one who continually abandons the old things so as to become anthropos, renewed in true knowledge, gnosis, and in order to remove the mirages of an aged, old, and deadly gnosis, deadly knowledge. The old things have passed. Christian must be distinguished by his non-conformism with respect to the old age of the aeon that finds himself living and must perpetually renew his mind. So this first references to Pauline theology, I think that already suggests some terms of comparison with the Husserl essays. Firstly, I think there seems to be a common element between Paul's reflection in general and that of Husserl. First, the exigence of renewal arises as a requirement imposed by a starting negative condition. The First World War for Husserl, the dominion of sin and of the law for Paul. At the same time, there is also a positive thrust present in the same social, cultural, historical reality in disgrace because of evil. For Husserl, the cultural legacy of the fathers, while for Paul, the fulfillment of history occurred in Christ, which represent the new par excellence. This also implies a different conception of history. For Husserl, the succession of events in history is first of all an extrinsic of a movement of reason, and therefore orientable teleologically towards a rational aim, progressively developed into several progressively arranged stages, phases. Paul has a radically different idea of history. There is a horizontal, deadly history that moves forward without any real development, and the radical, vertical event that has also already put an end to history, has already made the rest of the chronological time a weight that fights against tendencies that bring back to the old. There is also an analogy about the vocation that impels renewal, the Berufsleben, talking yesterday. Paul says in the Epistle to Philippians, says that he was apprehended of Christ, taken by Christ, while Husserl speaks of a beruf, a vocation that calls for spiritual activities and operations that provide to the artist, the scientist, or the philosopher a consciousness of beatitude. Now I'll introduce some more concrete comparison through some references to the Husserlian analysis of renewal as an individual problem. Renewal is the supreme theme of all ethics, right? Husserl, ethics that can be understood first in an individual sense and then as social ethics. With respect to the individual dimension, Husserl intends to clarify, I quote, die eigentümliche Werdensform der Selbsterneuerung der Selbstgestaltung zu dem neuen Mensch, the peculiar form of the becoming, of the renewal and transformation of self into a new man. End quote. The human acts that can and must lead to this aim are marked by not being subject to mere impulses and moved by the affections, but to be able to act in freedom, starting from the self, from the I, to have experiences in an authentically personal and free activity, to make their own decisions. This characteristic, which Husserl deepens, can lead to a positive inspiration that, always renewed in its motivation, is not, however, an always equal reality, but subject to satisfaction and disappointments, pain, worthless moments, conflicts between new and old values. Subject lives a life of struggle and consciously aspires to happiness in his own freedom. That is why, as he will write later, ethical life can be described as a continuous renewal. In this struggle, he understands how to move above all things to knowledge, a knowledge that has to lead in order to succeed, to give form to an action based on obvious rational considerations that create the conscience of the responsibility of reason or ethical conscience, Gewissen. From this awareness, according to Husserl, flow a desire for a rational self-regulation, the desire to give a new form to one's whole life under the sign of reason, a life founded on a perfectly good ethical conscience. This will be the form of life of authentic humanitas, the individual form to which renewing one's entire life leads, transforming oneself into a new, truly rational man. The new man, the true authentic man, is the rational man. On this element, the absolute primacy of the rational sphere, various divergences can be identified from the Pauline thought, even if Husserl, in a certain sense, identifies an ideal limit, limes or Grenze, in the difference between the absolute ideal and the relative ideal of perfection. The ideal of the perfect human man is an ideal of relative perfection, a man who is each time the best possible. Conversely, the ideal of absolute perfection is the idea of God, the absolute limit, the pole that transcends any finitude and to which every authentic human aspiration is directed. The idea of God is the idea that constitutes the authentic and true I that every ethical man carries in the interiority, desiring and loving God while feeling infinitely distant from him. Here too, the assonances with the Pauline discourse are many, but some different nuances bring the Husserlian discourse quite far from the heart of Pauline doctrine. Now it's possible to try to read Paul letters and try to grasp the line that Husserl might have followed. In that respect, first, it is possible to find confirmation of the primacy of freedom in a human action impressed by the divine will. Some biblical references, Romans, the Creator was made subject to vanity, but then shall be delivered from the servitude into the liberty of the glory of the children of God. Lord is a spirit, and where the spirit is of the Lord is, there is liberty. And you, Christians, faithful, have been called unto liberty. But we will also find that this new condition of the Christian implies a struggle for continuous renewal. As in Romans, where Paul stated that for the good which I will, I do not, but the evil which I will not, then I do. An inner struggle, ethical struggle. According to Paul, through this work of struggle and renewal, which is also but not only a remodeling of the ethical behavior in Christ, we arrive at the new man. Addressing the faithful who have chosen to follow the truth of Jesus, Paul says in Ephesians, to put off the old man who is corrupted and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. But the difference, actually, a not insignificant difference, is that the new man is not a new creation because of rationality, but because of faith. It is faith, not the wisdom of this world, for instance, that founds the perfection of God, of acting in the world towards that grenze, that infinitely distant limit that, however, in the house of Paul, had become incredibly close in the person of Christ. As already mentioned, the individual ethical problems lead to the wider examination of the renewal as a problem of social ethics. The object of the CEF formale Tuben der Kultur in der Menschheitsentwicklung. When Husserl traces history following the trace of the need for renewal that animated the different civilizations, Husserl focuses first on the societies centered on religion. First of all, the society where religion arises naturally, mythical society. In a specific sense of the term, writes Husserl, religion means in fact the highest level of mythical culture, in which these transcended entities are absolutized to divinities, to entities that give absolute norms. This was the characteristic of the Babylonian civilization, but also of the Jewish one. Religion was a norm that permeated both culture and life. Considered concretely, normal life and religious life coincided in these societies. Otherwise, according to Husserl, the Christian movement is born in the form of a religious movement of freedom. Here the focus is not on the norm, but on the law, but on the unitarian character of an original religious experience. A relationship originally lived directly with God, in which the subject of this intuition does not feel called by a God who opposes him outwardly. Here, the subject, originally united to God, is an incorporation of the same divine light. In my opinion, here Husserl is thinking of the experience of Paul, the apprehended apostle, as he defined himself in Philippians. In this transition between the primacy of the norm and of that of the freedom, can be glimpsed the passage announced by Paul between the word of the law and the time of the Spirit. In Romans, he says that there is now, therefore, no condemnation. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus had delivered me from the law of sin and of death. Or again, in Corinthians, who also has made us fit ministers of the New Testament, not in the letter, but in the Spirit. The letter killeth, but the Spirit quickeneth. It is possible to glimpse in Husserl an authentic correspondence with this Pauline idea of a transition from the Old Testament of the law and that of the freedom of the sons of God. But precisely in this passage from the primacy of the law to that of the freedom, some sets of problems are given. As I said before, in the Appendix 4, Husserl wrote that the figure of Christ encountered during the reading of the Gospels awakens in him the idea of a perfect goodness, of a purely good action, which is person desire to emulate Christ. So, with the reading of the Gospel, continues Husserl, he was filled with love for Christ, but seen as a super-empirical figure, incarnation of a pure idea. In front of Christ, Husserl experiences a sort of beatitude because he knows that this infinite person is related to him in a living way. Christ is an ideal figure, but also a concrete person that radiates a power that is already a reality for the reader, a reality that becomes power in one's life. This is the reason because everything is related to the search for salvation. And finding salvation is the act of the freeman, the tat defiant. The whole world is finally an infinite harmony, an infinite path of all people towards freedom, in which each has its own functional level. about to conclude. The problem is that in Paul, this relationship with Christ is not only an exemplary relationship, but a relationship in which there is literally an incorporation. In another appendix, Beilage 5, Kirche und christliche Wissenschaft, Husserl wrote about the idea of neue Menschentum, neue Menschheit, neue Mensch. But here we can find differences between Husserl and Paul, important differences. Husserl wrote, I read in English, but I think it's important to have the German text. True religion, therefore, is an eruption of freedom, ein Durchbruch der Freiheit. And in its path lies the church. And if it wants to be an universal religion of humanity, the eruption of a conscious tendency toward a freely produced culture, toward a renewed, genuine, or the formation of an entelequia consciously shaped in culture and cultural humanity, direct towards a new humanity, ein neues Menschentum, individual community, towards universally new systems of community orders, of norms of each individual and community formation, of norms of self-education to the new human being, neue Menschen, and so to speak of humanity's self-education to a new humanity, einer neuen Menschheit. This new order of the new man and of a new humanity follows that what Paul said about the new man, new creation, even if Paul does not think of an earthly order based on the rationality as the guide of free action, but on a sacramental eschatological reality in which perfect freedom corresponds to the rational ordering of the Logos of God. Reason and faith, a dilemma with which also Husserl confronts himself. He considers the non-rationality of the presupposition of faith incompatible as a starting point for freedom. Faith after reason and love, freedom. The reason that follows faith, the medial one, for Husserl, suffocates and prevents freedom. So in conclusion, for Husserl, renewal is an ethical movement founded in a purely rational sense, while for Paul, the new creation is an all-encompassing regeneration of the human that has ethical outcomes or involves new ethical practices, but there is a pre-rational route in which faith is the matrix of the renewal, the abandonment of self to God. This is perhaps the main reason that will lead Husserl to consider essentially philosophy to be the pure and true movement of freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Comments and questions. Yes, Irina, please. We have a question for you here.
Thanks for your talk, Lorenzo. So I think that,
you hear her?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that everybody agrees that there's a deep connection between the Caizos and like the Bible or the Christian tradition. But if I understand correctly, you want to separate faith and reason or rationality, and you're kind of saying that the truth is to be pursued by means of faith and not so much by means of rationality. And you kind of suggest that Husserl would say that also. But in the Caizos, Husserl says we need a rational faith. He has this phrase, a rational faith. We don't need a blind faith. He distinguishes between like the kind of faith that Adam and Eve had, is like a blind faith, and the kind of faith that we, the kind of beings that we are, can have. So this is just like an observation. Thank you.
Can I answer to this one?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think that it would be very interesting to put in communication in parallel these Husserlian essays with the various interpretation of Christian renewal. And for sure, there are, for example, medieval interpretation of reason and faith that could be a perfect point of conjunction with this kind of discourse. But in my presentation, I'm focused on Paul, because I found that there are some common points between the Husserlian analysis and the reading of the Pauline epistles. But I think that the interpretation of Husserl in this case is quite far from the Pauline interpretation, Pauline Christianity, Pauline doctrine. This, well, is not a complete theology, it's just the starting point of a new religion in the panorama of the antiquity societies. But it's Husserl himself that says that the medieval philosophy, medieval theology is far from an idea of freedom, and a freedom that starts for rational fundings. So it's Husserl himself that in certain sense refused the possibility of some parallels with medieval interpretation. I'm talking about medieval interpretations because is the large part in which Husserl confront his idea, his interpretation of renewal and Christian idea of renewal. But talking about Paul, I think that the idea of renewal, new creation, and new humanity, the discourse is quite similar in certain sense, but quite different in other important senses. I don't know if I was clear.
Thank you for the answer. And we have a comment in the chat by Lisa. I don't know, you can read it. She says, faith and reason seem to give themselves at different fields, and so has Husserl chosen for the last one, though? Has Husserl chosen for the last one, though, stating a parallelism between both? I don't understand that. But the question is if Husserl chose.
No, I think I hypothesize Husserl has not chosen between faith and reason. Husserl here is clarifying an aim and a funding, rational funding and rational aim. But is not refusing faith also because he was Lutheran Christian, so I think that for sure he doesn't refuse faith, and of course he wants to keep the faith and reason united. But maybe it's more a methodological, philosophical question here. But talking about Pauline epistles, we cannot, it is not possible to accept this kind of funding, this kind of aim, a rational humanity, a new or human order based on pure rationality is not the Pauline idea. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for this very original topic for the presentation. Is this part of your own PhD research, or I was thinking why choosing Paul for analyzing it in comparison with Husserl and not other figures?
Sorry, because I was listening to you, but also there are two.
Oh, okay. No,
two walls of texts.
Other people have priority. I will send you an email later. Irene Breuer says, and in my understanding, Husserl claims for a Vernunftglaube, like a rational faith, such that God is believed in on rational grounds. That is, to account for the rationality of human life. God is a guarantee that all irrationalities are reconciled into a higher form of rationality. Would you agree? Irene.
Well, I agree that in a certain sense is that Husserl stated in these essays, for sure. It's not important if I agree or no. It's not important to discern. It's more important to discern which kind of theological interpretation is the one to Husserl is connected, I think. But for sure, this is the Husserl interpretation as some theological roots, some contemporary theological roots, some Lutheran theological roots. Is not I say Lutheran is not narrow because it's not a mistake, because we are accustomed to say that Lutheran Christian theology is founded also only on faith, but also on interpretation. So it's always a difficult obstacle to understand which part is faith, which part is interpretation. But it's complicated. It's complicated.
Okay. I just before moving on for to the next conference, because we began late, so we're running a little late.
Mhm.
I just read you the comment that Alejandro left for you about he asked if you know a paper from Serrano de Aro that talks briefly about this relation between Husserl and Paul. And you know that paper?
Yeah, I know that paper. Yeah,
Okay.
but
So because then he quotes part of the paper. So
thank you very much for this.
Lorenzo, and thank you Alejandro, Irene, and Luisa, and everyone. So thanks. And
Yes.
now we will have our next presenter who is here with us, and Irina Simon. Okay. You want to sit here? Sorry, I was looking at the so I'm so confused with the language. So you sit here and you can use my computer. ¿Por qué no se enciende la cámara? La cámara.
Juana. Probemos si es que podemos compartir la pantalla, pero puede iniciar video.
Okay.
La pantalla la tienes que compartir.
We're doing it here. So sorry, I will check. Here you can but you can do like this. Okay, that's nice. Like you can mark and or mark are not very good. Yeah, because please just leave the power now. I see my here over here.
Well, hello, everybody. I am Irina Simmons, and I'm very glad to be here in Buenos Aires with these awesome people whom I thank for organizing this awesome conference. My paper on Husserl is not very technical because my intention in the long term is to write about Husserl to like the non-phenomenological public, like to introduce Husserl to people who don't necessarily want to do phenomenology, but they want to understand how can Husserl be used in like current debates in analytic moral philosophy, for example. So I think that it like this kind of analysis that Husserl does in the Caizo articles is very fit to debates, to the kind of debates in like meaning in life, for example, that Martha Nussbaum or Harry Frankfurt or Susan Wolf are engaged in. So I'll be reading my talk. So Husserl starts the Caizo articles by describing humanity as going through a sorrowful age of moral deprivation, the obviousness of which drains people of energy, leading them to experience powerlessness, lose faith, surrender to actuality as if life was governed by fate. And instead of experiencing the joy of being alive, they merely strive to keep alive. So the word joy will be very important for me in this talk, as well as the word embarrassment will be. So I kind of play joy against embarrassment. And I will say, so I think that Husserl associates blind love, blind attachment to value with the potential of embarrassment, and pure love with joy. So this is a quote from the beginning of the Caizos. So he says, and thus we feel compelled to say something new must happen. It must take place within us and be carried out by us as members of humanity who live in this world, forming the world and being formed by it. We are human beings, free-willing subjects who are actively engaged in our surrounding world, constantly involved in shaping it. Whether we want to or not, whether it is right or wrong, we act in this way. Could we not also act rationally? Do not rationality and efficiency stand in our power? Moral renewal can happen, according to Husserl, as motivated by rational faith in communal values and not according to mere natural and emotional appreciation of value. Only such clarity, this is a quote, only such clarity of thought can summon joyful work and give the will the resoluteness and the all-pervasive power to carry out acts of liberation. That is, rational faith can do that. Husserl's goal in the Caizo articles is therefore to show how we can recover ourselves as freewheeling and rational subjects, both the subject and the object of our striving. In this article, I'm interested in exploring the relationship that Husserl establishes between rational striving, pure love, and joy on the one hand, and passively pursuing pleasure values, blindly falling into love and embarrassment on the other hand. So my question is, why would someone desire to live a life dedicated to genuine value, and why would someone want to live an authentically human life? Why would someone desire that the love that guides their life is pure rather than blind? Ignorance seems to be more conducive to joy than reflectively striving towards the valuable with the awareness of the possibility of error. It seems to me that Husserl does not only argue that commitment to genuine value and to an authentic human life are objectively superior to non-genuine commitment and to the naive human life, but that he says that there is a first-person perspective reason that motivates us to ensure a genuine commitment to true value. In this article, I want to trace the Husserlian argumentation in support of this position. Husserl distinguishes between different kinds of personal lives from the perspective of attitudes towards value and the decisions towards self-regulation. The first kind of exceptional life that he mentions is the life of the person who develops the certainty of the unconditionally desirable for their entire life. This is the life of the person who knows what they love, who experiences this love very strongly, but does not have very clear reasons for why they love those things. Neither do they have a clear understanding for how practically reasonable loving those particular things is. The unconditionally desired values set the bottom line for whether a life is, from the first-person perspective, worthy of being lived or not. I was supposed just to show the first one, but sorry. So Husserl says, unconditionally desired values, without those continuous realizations, one's life can have no satisfaction. So this is the definition for how the unconditionally loved or unconditionally desired values, what is their relationship to one's life or to one's future. So in Husserliana 42, Husserl calls these values, the unconditional values, Selbstwerte or Lustwerte. They are the kinds of values one desires for the purpose of enjoyment with the concern of having an enjoyable life. They are associated with things or events that steer my feelings, that draw me, that I am enamored with, which affect me to act so that I realize the pleasure and enjoyment I represent them as bringing. The effort that I might put into realizing them, for example, into playing an musical instrument or a sport, is just a matter of pursuing them as a matter of enjoyment. Quote, I do what pleases me, and I realize the pleasurable as pleasurable, end of quote. The relationship with them stays under the mark of the present. Even though I identify them as the kind of values I want to have in my entire life, they are not a matter of an infinite end-of-life goal towards which I strive understandingly, or towards which I strive understanding that I will never fully realize, will never pass, will never leave behind. Their unconditionality amounts to them being instinctual, to not being pursued according to good or bad reasons. Quote, all instincts are blindly oriented towards a goal. When disclosed, it will see the goal, be awakened, and being awakened, and the wanting be awakened, and still it cannot see what really is that it wants towards. End of quote. Instincts, affective valuing, are defined according to Husserl by a blind striving direction and by an unconditional ought and will. The kind of life guided by a blind desiring would be a life lived unreflectively in the present, as a matter of successive responsive to the appeal. The relationship with pleasure values is similar to the relationship with things, with objects, with actual events. They are actualizable as a matter of actual doing. One desires to have them throughout their entire life as a matter of feeling particular moments. The relationship with them is not a matter of commitment over time, which Husserl suggests is one of the essential aspects of genuine love. Quote, love is not a momentary act, but a remaining desire for one person. End of quote. This is a definition for genuine value, for genuine love, indicating the absolutely valued, the unique kind of love that one can feel towards one particular person or towards one particular value that becomes incomparable to anyone or anything else, loved as a matter of general recognition of value. While neighborly love can can fall under the umbrella of the unconditionally desired, Husserl would probably argue that affection for a particular person only qualifies as love when its source is understanding, insight, seeing, and the particular beloved other. The particularities of genuine love are, I think. The first would be that the personal presence to value. Genuine love is not a generic expression of being human, by the expression of the person, of the spiritual in the human being. The second is that genuine love is a matter of decision. I would qualify the decision as expressing understanding followed by assuming commitment. It is an understandingly deciding to dedicate one's life to the protection of a value, to live a life that becomes an example of what it is to value a particular something. And third, the decision is a matter of remaining decided. One's deciding extends over the time of one's life. It is probably the kind of decision, the kind of experience that is not taken in time, according to historical time, but in what we could call absolute time. Not in the time of the practical, but in the time of the absolute. Self-values or pleasure values are not a matter of being morally evaluated or being labeled as objectively good or bad values. And whether they are genuine or not is also not a concern. Husserl calls the life of the person who identify why they unconditionally desire exceptional, even though this identification is not a matter of decision or followed by a decision of striving commitment. What makes this life exceptional is the fact that this identification envisages the entirety of one's life. Well, I messed up the quotes. Above all, what addresses us here is the general point that a disposition of unconditional devotion to valued goals, springing from the unconditionality of its longing, becomes a principle of regulation of life. The devotion may be completely irrational, as it were that of a blind falling in love or infatuation, Verliebtheit, Husserl says, or it may be otherwise. The unconditionally valued are candidates for genuine or pure love, for the kind of love that is the result of a decision to commit oneself to the value and to embrace it in one's will. Such decision turns the self-values or the pleasure values into absolute values of genuine value. I would like to emphasize that Husserl does not use the phrase blind love, so he doesn't say blinden Liebe, to name the opposite of pure love, to define the kind of attitude that unconditionally binds us to the value. But he says blinden Verliebtheit, which into English would be better translated as a blind falling in love or infatuation. So where the falling is emphasized as opposed to choice that goes into commitment. One's being verliebt amounts to one having fallen into something as a matter of fascination, the same word that Kant gives to the blind passion, according to the, okay, so I won't read that quote, but I have a quote where Kant talks about blind passions, like blind, being altruistically blind, or being blindly altruistic, the kind of altruism that is innate. We're just born, some of us are just born altruistic, and they just blindly are altruistic without understanding. So he uses the same word that Husserl uses for blind falling in love. To be blindly in love, to be fascinated, in Kant's own words, bewitched, Bezauberung, with something is not to be the source of that law, but to be unconditionally subjected to it. I'm interpreting unconditional to mean without having given the conditions of one's love, that is, without having the reasons for one's love. So as if you're in love, but you don't have good or bad reasons for why you're in love. You're just in love. Your love is beyond right or wrong. You're just love. For Kant, loving blindly is just another name for instinctual love. In a text published in Husserliana 42, we find Husserl wondering whether instinctual love does not straightforwardly indicate lack of love. Quote, and what role does instinctive play? What role does the instinctive play? Instinctive love, sex drive, social instinct, etc. Isn't the striving towards pleasure, when it rules, a falling into lovelessness? End of quote. While we can say that instinctual striving focuses on receiving, love is a giving with its source in the self. Instinctual striving is selfless striving. It is probably not even very accurate to describe the person motivated by instincts as striving, as long as one is absorbed by the instinctually valued rather than works towards the actualization of a value as a matter of choice and commitment. To be instinctually driven is to be blindly propelled towards the naturally desired rather than an expression of personhood and personal commitment. Such abandoning is a negative choice. It is a refusal to choose, to will, to strive. Consciousness of the possibility of choice, of willing, and of being the source of one's reasons for satisfaction always accompanies the negative choice concerning the self. Therefore, one cannot avoid experiencing the negative choice as a refraining from doing, refraining from being, refusing to act, and as not being motivated to act. The experience of refusing to will, to the extent that it reflects being overwhelmed by having to be a self, cannot be a very joyful one. Husserl does not seem to think that someone could willfully choose passivity, because that would amount to refusing pursuing a better life. And we have this very funny quote where Husserl uses the word dumb, and I find it very amusing. So he says, rational willing, I want the better and the best among the practically possible. If I choose the less good, or I remain passive, then I'm dumb. And he just leaves it at that. He says nothing more. He just ends the paragraph with that. So I won't like pause on that, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I find a suggestion as to why Husserl describes the life of the unconditional valuing, despite its lack of genuine rational commitment, as exceptional in the relationship he establishes between self-knowledge, self-evaluation, and self-determination. Husserl identifies self-consciousness, understood as self-reflection, as the core essential human capacity conditioning the idea of an ethical life. In order to describe the ethical life of the genuine human, Husserl starts by identifying the human particularities that constitute the conditions for the possibility of such a life. Quote, as a point of departure, we take the essential capability of human beings of self-consciousness in the precise sense of personal self-reflection, inspectio sui, and the capability grounded therein of reflectively taking positions vis-a-vis oneself and one's life, that is, the capability of personal life, of personal acts of self-knowledge, self-evaluation, and of practical self-determination, self-willing, and self-formation. End of quote. One is to have self-knowledge in order to be able to self-evaluate. By means of self-evaluation, one assesses the goodness or badness of one's practical character according to its particular qualities and dispositions. Self-evaluation envisages one's actual and potential acts, motives, means, goals, and end goals as the expression of innate and acquired character traits. Character traits suggest the direction one's actual and potential praxis is naturally headed towards. The purpose of self-evaluation is to stir one's life towards a chosen goal rather than to allow it to flow towards where nature pointed it. By means of self-evaluation, one can stir from passively and unfreely following inclination and effective motives and goals towards acting freely from the I center, Husserl says. By means of self-evaluation, quote, by means of self-evaluation, one's passive motivation is called into question with the intention of making decisions of will only on the basis of the resulting comprehension of the state of affairs and the general possibilities and relative values realizable therein. End of quote. Self-evaluation allows the subject to transition from involuntary to a willing, voluntary acting subject, the personal executor of its deeds, Husserl says. Self-consciousness, which I propose that can also be called self-giveness, is structured along self-knowledge, self-evaluation, and self-determination. Each of these three indicates a stage of the constitution of the I. My suggestion is that the exceptional aspect of a life in which there's knowledge of the unconditionally valued is self-knowledge. The person who identifies their blind love knows what they want. They know what is the source of satisfaction for their life. I would argue that Husserl considers mere self-knowledge, lacking any degree of self-evaluation and self-willing, just an abstraction. Someone who has self-knowledge has their life given as a whole, where the whole expresses a relationship to time as a sum of future presents filled with the value, with what one is blindly and unconditionally in love with. It's the life of the I that does not carry itself, that does not willfully strive towards a self-sourced life end, but which expects itself. I said, the I here is not the source of the time of its life, but rather the I is the sum of events filled with unconditionally valued. The unity of this life is established externally rather than internally. A life that is not exceptional in this minimal way, a life that lacks even mere self-knowledge, is lived with a lack of knowledge of the unconditional desire of what makes life worth living for me. As tempting self-abandonment to the effectively and unconditionally valued mind sound, our essential being in the future amounts to a constitutional giveness of the possibility of difference, of something else actually being the case. The person who knows themselves strongly, effectively, valuing something also projects the possibility of its devaluation. The self-knowledge according to which the unconditionally valued is given prompts self-evaluation as an attempt to prevent devaluation and loss of value. The given possibility of devaluation threatens the possibility to enjoy the unconditionally valued throughout one's life. This threat is a motive to do something to prevent the devaluation. The giveness of the possibility of devaluation does not only threaten the loss of an external value, but it is a threat of self-devaluation. Being aware of possible devaluation of what one effectively values creates, quote, embarrassing experience of negation and doubt, end of quote. The embarrassing disappointments that accompany the recognition of value depreciation motivate a critical striving towards truth and evidence, quote, towards ultimate justification through insightful grounding, end of quote. The embarrassment of disappointment motivates most immediately the striving towards the truth of singular practical goals, and it gradually grows into a striving towards the universal justification of a life, the kind of justification that would guarantee pure, firm satisfaction. So why would the awareness of the possibility of depreciation produce embarrassment if what lost value was just something in the world? Why would doubt be experienced as embarrassment if it regarded the truthfulness or the truth of something in the world? Quote, "The I is a practical I, it strives towards something it wills, but it stands under the law of self-preservation. It can only persist as an I when there is finality or determination in its decisions. It might be inclined to reassess its decisions and to rid itself of its convictions. It is therefore inclined to become untrue to itself, as long as it is only what it is in its convictions. But then it won't only have to arrive at new convictions, but it has to be able to be sure of them, that it won't again be or could be in the position to give up again its already formed convictions, and that it won't yet again have to convince itself independently that its objective convictions lack ultimacy. It must be convinced of the fact that it can reach convictions that remain final and which can give final stability to its being as a personal I." End of quote. One suggestion this paragraph makes that I would like to address is that willing is intrinsic to desiring. Desiring, if understood at its limit as wanting the value to become mine, to become part of my life as coming towards me, as giving itself to me, is never experienced in its purity, unaccompanied by the sense of the possibility of going towards it, of making it mine. Every passive desiring is an impulse towards striving, towards activity. Our beliefs and valuing are accompanied by self-consciousness, by an I believe this, I value this, I choose this. The strength or the reality of the I is directly proportional to the clarity of one's beliefs and reasons for valuing and choice. The more clarity, the less doubt. The more clarity, the more self-confidence, which extends in the future, promising the persistence of the I. To value something as a matter of affection unconditionally is to be ignorant of the reasons for which that thing is valuable, and therefore of the reason for its possible devaluation. Confronting the idea of one's being wrong is embarrassing to the extent that one cannot predict under what circumstances they will discover themselves wrong, under what circumstances they will have to give themselves up. One is blindly confronted with the possibility of error. Blindness of the possibility of devaluation amounts to a blind kind of self-doubt. Ignorance of the reasons for the desirability of something amounts to ignorance of the reasons for conditions that make that thing undesirable. That brings about a high level of insecurity regarding the persistence of the value and of the satisfaction that it brings in one's life. The need to secure satisfaction for our future life and the need to experience oneself as having reality motivates us to engage in reflectively supplying reasons and evidence for what we effectively value. In order to secure a blessed life, our unconditional valuing needs to gain understanding and to be assumed as a commitment. Instead of the I's life being sourced by value-filled events, the I becomes the source of such value-filled events. To strive towards becoming causa sui, or towards my life being my own creation, amounts to aiming that all naivete be replaced with clarity, truth, and justice. At the level of the practical, the striving is rational, while at the level of the absolute, the striving is understanding and committed. Husserl does not promise that a rational approach to the value amounts to the possibility of eliminating error from one's future life. The understanding and committed striving presupposes a mature accepting and assuming of the possibility of error, of bad luck, and of failure, and the commitment to do one's best to avoid them. The opposite would be an optimism fueled by ignorance. A blessed life is not one out of which the possibility of error has been eliminated. Quote, so long as we strive, so we err. That is, so long as we are human. We should thereafter take error of every type, not only as an open possibility of essence, but also already through the essential relation of humans to a natural environment as a possibility that is factually inevitable in every conceivable human life. End of quote. I'll be done. Husserl describes the paradisiac infallibility as blind and accidental because the lack of reason makes evidence and justification impossible, while the paradisiac human would inhabit the world naively, quote, drifting along the external environment, end of quote. The human is self-aware, self-reflective, aware of the possibilities of success and failure, satisfaction and dissatisfaction, of the possibility of living a blessed or unblessed life. The blessed human life is not depicted in the image of the perfect paradisiac innocence. Rather, it is the life of the person with a perfect, quote, with a perfectly good conscience, or a life the subject of which is able always and perfectly to justify itself. End of quote. The best possible life a person can hope for is the one in which one experiences themselves as being able to act, quote, according to one's best knowledge and conscience, end of quote. According to Husserl, both pure unconditional valuing as well as the expectation of ideal perfection are paralyzing and actually not human realities. The I lives in actions that are absolutely self-justified. From the ideal self that one shapes reflectively follows the ethical form of life as the pure one, as the only one absolutely good and categorically demanded. Quote, what might have been good for the I before it grasped the ideal of reason and its true I ceases to be good as such, and every pure blessedness which could have been previously gained ceases to be valid unconditionally and to be true blessedness in itself. Only that which is absolutely justified on the basis of universal willing of a life based on practical reason, best knowledge and conscience, only that is good. End of quote. In agreement with Kant, Husserl concludes that genuine value is experienced as absolute, as a categorical imperative for one's life. Pure, true, genuine love is insightful giveness of a commandment rather than a blind drive towards a pleasure value that is pursued for the enjoyment that it produces, and something the conditions for the realization of which are irrelevant. The blindly, unconditionally desired is beyond right and wrong. The possibility of renewal is conditioned by personally assuming the possibility of error, the possibility that I can be wrong. Assuming that I am but an erring human, I start to distance myself from what I'm blindly fallen in love with and towards developing a pure love. Assuming that I am but an erring human, I remove the fear of the embarrassment of discovering myself as being wrong and joyfully strive towards gaining insight and evidence. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Irina. What you want to say? So thank you for this great presentation. And do we have comments, preguntas, comentarios? Let's see the chat here. Okay, so while people are thinking, I I can ask you a question. I have one question, one general question regarding what you say at the beginning. Your intention to present Husserl's philosophy or Husserl's phenomenology or this aspect of Husserl's philosophy to people who are not experts in phenomenology, but maybe come from other traditions. And you mentioned some examples like that. Maybe we can relate Husserl's ideas on law with Karl Frankfurt's analysis. And so very general question. Do you think, I don't know, which author or how do you think Husserl relates to more contemporary approaches to love, such as Frankfurt's approach to love or values of love?
Right. So within analytic philosophy, the concern with meaning of life is just starting to be a concern. It's not like traditional. They even accept there is such a thing as meaning, other than meaning of words or meaning of sentences. And I think that the kind of analysis that Husserl does in the Caíso is the type of analysis that can be, shaped or can be interpreted in the concern with meaning in life. And central in this analysis is the kinds of the different kinds of law relate us to value, both in Harry Frankfurt and in Susan Wolf and in Martha Nussbaum, who are concerned with the idea of meaning in life. They will also be concerned with law and what role does law play in finding meaning in life or having a meaningful life. So this is just like it's not like I started to do the work. It's just a thought. There's richness there. There's work to be done.
Yes, I agree with you, and it's important, I think, because most non-continental or researchers doing non-continental philosophy, if they try to find an author who worked on this topic, they wouldn't go to Husserl, but to Scheller. It's like if you try to find someone in phenomenology who speaks about these things and you don't come from a phenomenological tradition, everyone tells you have to read Scheller. And
and there's a lot of Scheller in Husserl's Caíso and in Husserl's concern with law, but of course Scheller is much easier to read than Husserl.
Yeah.
So like the analytic philosopher, they also tend not to speak German, so they need someone to help.
And Luisa had asked, could it be said that unconditionality
unconditional activity and truth allows
love and then joy?
So this was kind of this is what I was questioning, right? If we think of like the non-philosopher, right? Like how they go about their life, you might find the idea that just enjoying whatever you desire, you'll have a happier, easier life, right? Where you don't put a lot of effort into producing value, you're just an appreciator, right? You just appreciate what comes towards you. Husserl says that there's no such thing, or human beings are just not like that, because in every desiring, we are also, right, in every desiring is a valuing. And every valuing, every conscience of value comes with the conscience of a possible devaluation, of possible loss. And if we don't know the reasons and the conditions under which what we value can be enjoyed, if we don't know the reasons or the conditions under which what we value, what we desire might lose value, then we don't we're kind of like we're not joyful, right? We're not secure that we will have that value or that we will have that pleasure in our future lives. So in wanting to secure the presence of the values in our future life, we're motivated to strive to work in a rational way towards producing it or towards securing it in our life. That's kind of how I interpret it.
No, I think there is even some relation with Pali's presentation yesterday about needs and how, so maybe one could think that the need or the care, the preoccupation to maintain the value in the future is what moves you in the present. But there is always, not only for what you have said today and what in other presentations, and also the Lorenzo's presentation, I think there is always this feeling of insecurity and the danger, the danger and the consciousness of the vulnerability and the danger of what you call devaluation, which is, but one could also interpret it in other terms, like what you are afraid of is not of devaluation, but of losing the ability to feel the joy or losing the joyfulness that
Right.
gives
So
you.
I think that Husserl says that there's when one is not active, in producing value, they feel worthless in a way, right? And he says that there is no such thing as a life without error. There is no such thing as a human being without the consciousness of error. But there is such a thing, like there is that we can say, I did my best, right? So this security that we did our best is what gives us joy. The doubt that maybe we didn't do our best, to secure a good life for ourselves or to secure value, that's what embarrasses us.
Yeah. And yeah, there is certainly a lot to talk about it. But we thank you very much for the presentation and thank you for the questions. And we will keep talking about it. Sure. Now we will take a break. Oh my God. Sara. No, está aplaudiendo. Sara is applauding. No?
It's okay, it's okay.
Sara, ya sabes que no se distinguir el aplauso de la mano levantada. Así que me podés mandar un mensaje.
Está bien, no te preocupes.
Quizás cuando volvemos de la pausa, podés hacer tu pregunta, ¿querés?
Bueno, en parte ha sido discutida ahora con tu comentario, así que está bien. Gracias.
Gracias. Vamos a tomarnos una pausa, perdón, la pausa estaba programada para antes, un poco antes, pero como nos retrasamos con el comienzo, es una pausa corta de 15 minutos, vamos a hacer una pausa de 15 minutos y en 15 minutos volvemos. Okay, so thank you everyone for the presentations. We will take a break now and the next session will be in Spanish.